Hello.
Thank you also for participating in TRAIECT.
Thank you for being here as well.
You're welcome. We can all be happy to be here. I learned about you that you also, first you were not a contemporary composer, so your way of learning is also not linear, so not musical students, as I say, but then you first were a rock musician,
Yes.
and then you come to noise music, and now coming to contemporary composing now here, being in Germany since 2016. For your approach to TRAIECT, what was it what interested you the most in this project, and what did you have an immediate idea of what you wanted to do, or after the workshop?
So I think I was most attracted by the prospect of working with completely, to me, novel instruments. I didn't know anything about them. But I've been to Vietnam before, and I undoubtedly heard, say, a tambao coming from like a song on the bus when they put the music on and did a film on or something. But I wouldn't have been able to say anything about it, describe it in no way, nothing. So it was really, I think it's really cool, and it's a fantastic opportunity being able to write for these instruments, because you're not going to be walking down the Liste Meiler in Hannover and someone's going to say, "Oh, excuse me, sir, would you like to write for a Vietnamese traditional music people instrument?" So yeah, that I found really appealing. And to your second question, so from the workshop, I didn't really know what I was going to do musically, but and also I didn't know which instrument or voice I was going to write for. But when I saw Chami plugging the cable into her instrument, I thought, okay, this is like a guitar, it's my instrument. And I thought that's going to go straight into an interface somewhere at some point in the future.
Okay. And so you are writing for tambao. What did you then write for? What was your idea when you were writing this piece then? Is it electric guitar?
In a way, yes. And yeah, but it is very different to the electric guitar for quite a few different reasons. I mean, they're completely different instruments, but you can achieve a similar sound sometimes in certain ways, and also because you can apply effects, just like how electric guitar works. So you normally have the guitar, cable goes through a bunch of effects pedals, which is typical, and that goes into an amp. With my piece, the cable comes out to tambao, goes into a computer with their effects, and that comes out into the speakers and everything. But it's not written like rock music, at least not completely. I mean, it's not a rock piece. I'm not trying to relive my adolescence. But what I'd say, the piece is very much for Chami. So, and it is very much inspired by the Vietnamese approach to writing and playing. So, whereas my music these days, actually even when I used to write a lot of rock music, it was always very precise. Like things happen at a very precise moment in time. That. And one of the things I took away from the workshop is that isn't Chami's style. And then when I read a bit about Vietnamese music, I thought, okay, that isn't the Vietnamese style either. So how can I incorporate this into my piece? And the upshot of it is that my piece is very free, which contrasts with a lot of my other music. It has a very rigid form, so things happen in certain ways, and sometimes very specific pitches are notated. But what goes on around those pitches is often left to the performer. Yeah.
Okay. And for the electronic, you said you have certain effects. Do they have, what connection do they have to the music? Do they connect to the traditional music, or is it, did you choose them freely, or?
Well, the main effect, there's two main things which happens with the signal. And this is not just for the tambao, but also a synth which I built, and which kind of mirrors the sound of the down bow. One of them is distortion, because I love distortion, and the music, the rock music, a lot of the rock music I've always been a big fan of, uses distortion in a big way. And that isn't to say that the music is necessarily aggressive, it's just this is a sound that goes with the music. Sometimes they're very pretty or very simple melodies, but then you have a very thick guitar sound behind it. And I also love the diversity of different distortions. You can do different things with distortion to get different sounds. I think it's great. So that's one of them. And then linked to distortion, but it's not really an effect per se, but it's an approach to handling the signal, is the use of feedback. And this is a direct reference of sorts to playing the electric guitar, where if you say leave the strings there and they start vibrating a little and you're stood next to the amp, you know, the sound will start feeding back and you get this sound. And there are like a number of bands who I like who used to who do use feedback, or there are at the very least moments in rock songs which I remember very distinctly because feedback's there, even if it's not intentional. And so it's like this accident which happens, but it becomes part of the piece. So what I do in my piece is control the amount of feedback every now and then, both for my synth down bow and for the real down bow.
So you were saying that you have your own influences, the rock music and then the distortions, and you have the improvisations from the Vietnamese style. Is there any other techniques or styles that you pick up from the workshop that come into your piece?
Well, there's yes, and there are also other external influences which are perhaps noteworthy. So again, this is a piece for Jamie, and one thing I remember her saying at the workshop, we showed, you may remember, that we showcased a few of our pieces, and one of my then recent pieces was a solo piece for violin, and it's technically very difficult. And I remember Jamie watching that, and after, oh God, well, might have to play something like that. and she also said that she doesn't like it when there's really complicated rhythms, which makes sense because traditionally in Vietnamese music they wouldn't be notated at all. In actual fact, you will hear Jamie playing very complicated rhythms, but accidentally, because of the freedom and the element of improvisation. But also, with my piece, one thing that was very important to, as a kind of skeleton for forming the events, is where the individual notes come from. So I found it quite difficult to write for the down bow because it's essentially a melody instrument. You can do, I think some of the other guys might have something actually to share about this, but you can do certain other things to get multiple tones sounding at once, but it's essentially you play one note at a time. And unlike, say, a trumpet or a flute or a violin, but very much like an electric guitar, when you strike the string, it decays immediately. You play it, it decays. It doesn't decay straight away, but you can't go naturally down, you know, it will just die. So what I did was choose a number of pre-existing melodies from different sources, which I think for the most part are completely unrecognisable in the piece. So there's a piece by from an album, which is one of my favourite albums, which is actually basically a pop song for acoustic guitar and voice. There's a traditional Vietnamese melody, which Channy chose, So I asked him for some recommendations, and this is one of them. There's and then there's a melody from a piece I wrote several years ago, and then a fragment from part of a piece I wrote even before that. And on top of that, there is actually, in an indirect way, a quasi-lickety approach to how notes relate to each other, but again, completely unrecognisable, which comes later in the piece.
So if you were to write again, now that after you've done all this process, what would be the next thing for you to explore, or would you build upon what you have and then try to
I think what I would do if I were to write for the Dambao and electronics again, it would just take the improvisation to the next level. So it would be even freer. As I said already, there is still a fairly rigid form. Things happen in a certain order. It's just that what happens on a sort of the small scale is to some degree undetermined. But yeah, I think I would make it even freer, perhaps with an open form and more flexibility. And I'd also probably take the things which I like the most, maybe some certain sounds, because if I were to criticise myself for this piece as it is, it perhaps, I mean, there are very clear ideas which perhaps don't seem to always be related to each other. But maybe not. I'll leave that to the listeners to decide.
Is there at this point already questions from the audience that you would like to ask James about him or his piece?
I do always question.
That's good. After this, the ice is broken.
I picked in your rehearsal, and I don't know, like I would like to ask you, or maybe also about like how was to play together, because I think it's very different for both of you, because you play electronics, but you really play, like you play on the keyboard and also the effects, but you really play. You play in this case with a traditional instrument, and you play traditional instrument but with someone who plays on a MIDI keyboard with electronics, and for what I picked it works very well. So I don't know, how was the rehearsal experience?
I think generally pretty well, but I was quite nervous beforehand. Not just because I didn't really know how it was going to sound in the end, like mixing an instrument, I don't really know that well still now, and something I basically programmed in my bedroom, but also because although I have a fair amount of experience playing with bands, a lot of the time when I've played concerts, I have been drinking alcohol. And so, not always, but you know, there is often a gin and tonic on the stage. And so to play something very precise with pages and, you know, to have to really concentrate is a very different experience. And there were definitely times, I mean, yeah, I printed out the score from the printer down the hallway, and I don't know why, but if you print something double-sided with that printer, it flips it the other way around. So it's like, okay, up this way, next it's upside down. So it means if you turn the pages, you have to turn them and sort of turn them like this at the same time. So for the first few days, that was distracting. And yeah, and also, I'm glad we've rehearsed quite a lot, and I think it's been quite a good experience. But it's also made me think a lot about, I mean, yeah, which controls were most important to me, because there are a lot of controls. And so I'm playing, like Emily said, a MIDI keyboard. there are controls to control my sound and Tramby sound. There are also some recordings, so cues which are used, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So for the final performance, so this is something that we discovered during rehearsals, we're going to have Joachim sort of mixing, controlling the levels, because it's one less thing for me to worry about.
So I didn't hear anything of the piece at all so far, but since you're describing that you are so much influenced by rock music, which mostly is very loud.
Yes.
So my question is, how do dynamics play a role in your composition?
Well, I won't spoil the surprise of my piece, but loudness does play a role. Or the intention, or maybe not loudness, as in you hopefully won't walk away with painful ears. But I'd say that in my music in general, I think loudness is not enough. And actually one thing I've learned a lot since my studies here is that having things very quiet and very refined and with lots of details is great. But what I absolutely love about a lot of the rock music which I was into, which I still like, is that there's also often this very expressive way of playing, particularly with the band, and when you have an audience there who has stood up, and again, if you've been drinking, and say, for instance, what is very common at the end of a lot of sets with bands is there'll be this bit where they always go bang, 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 bang. It's a cliche, basically. Although there are bands who have utilised this to make it an element of their music within a set as well. I think it's just really cool, and it's a really cool effect. So, but that naturally comes with loudness. It's a very loud gesture, essentially. So yeah, that is very much embedded in my music as well, and in this piece specifically.
I tell a secret. When we were rehearsing here in this space.
For 2 years.
Sorry?
No, he said it's a secret, so I told them to close
No,
the ears.
it's a public secret now. But so you know, it's always a question: do you add a subwoofer or not? So we started without, and we thought, okay, let's see what the composers are saying. And Essan and the other Essan, the mixer boss Essan, and me, we said, and then when for the rehearsal of James' piece, we said, no, we need a subwoofer.
So it's going to be. I'm going to be also. Should we bring?
No, I mean, now it's going to be a massive disappointment because most of the piece is not like that at all. And there are a lot of quiet elements.
Okay.
And in fact, we were also quite careful to make sure that certain parts weren't loud.
Okay.
But I'd say this is definitely, this is a direct influence from rock music, and yeah, it does play an important part in the form of the piece, I'd say.
Any more questions or?
Yeah. Could we bring alcohol for you?
Bring a what?
Alcohol.
Oh, no, I won't be able to concentrate. Maybe in Berlin.
And after the concert.
Yes.
Yes.